Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, I'll get started. We've got 11 people here, so um, I'm hoping this can be a continuation of your thinking from last week. And so you want to think about the issue of housing justice, of gentrification, of eviction, and unequal property access. You'll want to start thinking about the case study that we did in this class about the individual who's unable to get housing, who's denied housing for a variety of reasons. And then you want to think about kind of what can be done about it. So you last week learned about one organization that is doing what they think is helpful. You want to think about that critically. Is that helpful? Would you find that helpful for you? And then how does that relate to law? So this is called Law as a Double-Edged Sword, which is a kind of famous reference that's often used, is that law has two edges. So it goes one way and then it goes another. And we want to think about that in relationship to consciousness, which is a very fancy word for awareness. And then we want to think about that. Does that awareness lead to mobilization? Do people actually do something when they know that they have rights? So the basic idea here is that on the one hand, one edge of the law is about social control, and the other edge of the law is about individual rights, sometimes called freedom, sometimes called liberty. So the first thing we have to remember that we've been studying in this class is that the U.S. constitutional legal system, its first priority is about how to organize a government that protects private property. And we've talked about this quite a bit, so I won't go into too much detail, but if you have questions about that, let me know. But on the other hand, the other side of the sword are individual rights, in which you will only go along with that legal order of private property if it protects you as well. So you need the compliance of all the residents of that system. So if we think about this from the issue of housing justice, you probably, you typically have thought about it, and in conversations in this class, we've thought about it as an individual's right to housing. So that would be on the right side, or one side of the sword. That's individual rights. But there's another side to the sword, which is the governmental power. So the organization of government officials, and in collaboration with builders and construction workers and banks and speculative financiers and all these other people that are involved in housing, that they have the right or the duty to create a system that we call zoning, and that's basically, kind of how it sounds, creating zones within the area that regulate what can be built, how it can be built, and who it's for. And so that's the left side, that's the social control side. That's the side of the sword that's trying to organize people to protect private property. So these two things aren't always in favor of each other, right? They're often in clash, they're often in contradiction. And so this is what we want to kind of get deeper into today, as we've seen over the last several weeks that I think it's obvious, I think you should have learned by now, that the system is biased towards zoning for wealthier people, and it's biased against zoning for poorer people or working class people. And so the question that should jump up now is, knowing that that's not fair and that's not completely legal, what can be done about it? So to get a little bit deeper, then we have to understand what these edges do. So one edge, the social control edge, is all about reducing your rights. And that means that it's taking all of the possibilities of all of the things that could happen between us as human beings and all the agreements we could make, and it reduces it to a set of what are called explicit or listed rights that have been recognized by legislatures. And that can be the local city legislature, NYC, it can be the state, New York State, or it can be Congress, it can be the federal legislature. So if they've passed what's called a positive law, they've passed a law that protects a right of yours, then that is recognized by the courts as part of the social control. something to think about that you really need to understand is that those rights, those individual rights, will never contradict the right to private property. And so this is why politicians, when they talk about socialism, they either say that it's impossible for that to happen in the United States, or they're trying to terrify you that it's happening, is that that's constitutionally impossible, is that the Constitution protects first and foremost private property. So the courts always balance or reduce your rights, your individual rights, to balance the interests of private property. So again, that's one side of the sword, and that's the social control side. The other side of the sword expands all of the possibilities of human reactions. So those could include some of those legislature approved rights, and those, there are not many of those rights. But for example, let's say at the federal level, you have the right to own a gun, right? In New York, you don't have the right to own a gun. So those can override with this kind of general idea in natural law, right? That in the world, you have the right to own a gun, meaning you have the ability to go purchase a gun. Or in some ways, you know, you could build it if you get that stuff off the internet and you figure out how to do that. So it's kind of like the common sense are the fundamental rights. Those are things that are self-evident. You have the ability to purchase a gun, but the courts don't always recognize that ability. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So let me give you a super practical example because it's in the media right now, is the issue of abortion. So lots of people are very confused about this, largely because they're not constitutional law students like you. So lots of people are talking about, I have the right, I have the right. Okay, great, right? Everybody wants to have their own rights. That's one side of the sword. The other side of the sword is that the court is going to declare what the social order is. And so the dilemma that's always been a part of the legal cases, from Roe v. Wade to Planned Parenthood to a bunch of other cases, Carhart, there's a lot of cases that are all involved, is that they all come from this central case or original case called Griswold versus Connecticut, where the court took a fundamental right approach. They said it's self-evident that everyone should have the right to privacy. Now that sounds good, right? We all say that's common sense. I should have the right to privacy. The problem is that no legislatures have recognized that right to privacy. So there's no congressional law that says that you and I have a right to privacy. So you see that conflict there. And that's largely what this quote-unquote so-called leaked memo is all about, is that many judges, most judges in fact, believe that local legislatures should decide whether you have the right to privacy. So in other words, if people in the state of Texas don't want to have the right to privacy, they want to have a more socially restrictive or a reduced idea of human interactions, constitutionally they're allowed to do that. If New York wants to have a more expansive idea that everyone in New York has the right to privacy, then New York is allowed to do that. But there's not one rule that says that everybody has the right to privacy. Now, Congress could do that, and this is largely what some politicians are arguing now, is that Congress should do that. But they haven't done that. And there's lots of issues like this. So, you know, you have a fundamental or a natural self-evident right to housing, but you don't have a legislature right to housing, right? No law has been passed saying you have a right to housing. You have a natural, self-evident right to keep yourself healthy, right? But you don't have a legislative right to health care, right? So you see these kind of conflicts going in. There's the reduction of rights and there's the expansion of rights. So let me stop there just to make sure there aren't any questions in what I've gotten to so far. Does anybody have any questions, or is this clear so far?
It's clear.
Okay, if something jumps up or a comment, right, or a question, you can always drop it in the chat and I'll get to that there. So far you're seeing there's these two sides, and now we want to see, so what, right? So how this works out is, you know, pretty interesting, but also kind of very problematic. So on the one hand, we have this idea that we want to limit or cut or restrict rights in order to maintain social control. So if you ever take a legal class again, two words that you'll probably hear are stability and predictability. And what this generally means is that the courts are supposed to make decisions that are going to make people clear about what they can and cannot do. And that's the predictable side. So the court will make a decision saying you should know what you're able to do. It should also be about stability. So it should try to reconcile or mediate or try to limit the controversies that exist in social relations. So a pretty famous, taken for granted concept is the First Amendment, free speech. So lots of people, you hear them, they say, I have a right to free speech. Again, that's self-evident, that's natural, you can literally say whatever you want all day, your voice isn't going to be taken away from you by some magic device, but you are limited, right, by the social control, the restricted rights. And the courts have ruled over and over, but in a particular case, Ward versus Rock against racism in 1989, that the government, the police, people can limit your rights or cut your rights to three categories: the time when you say these things, the place where you're saying those things, and the manner, how you're doing it. Now, this is controversial, right? So you have this, very ridiculous statement by the president, Trump at the time, that the protesters, he wasn't concerned with Minnesota or New York, but he did suddenly get concerned when they were D.C. He made this statement, and he asked if the police would do this, that when the protesters came around the White House, that they would be shot. Now, there's lots of controversy and people are very upset about this, but this isn't the first time that the government has done this. In fact, they did it in Portland during those same protests. They've done it with the Rodney King beatings in the 80s in LA. They've done it in Seattle with the W2O protests in the 1990s, right? And so the government has done this over and over and over again. So they've limited your right to free speech, your self-evident, your obvious right to say and protest in the way that you think is best, based on those three categories. When did you protest? Where were you protesting? And in what form were you protesting? So you can see that this is very different than what people say. They say, I have a right. They don't say, I have the right to free speech except for in certain places at certain times and in certain ways, right? And that's the reality of the situation, is that your rights are restricted. They're cut down by governmental actors, allegedly in order to maintain social control. Now, there's three rules that the court has put forward that they're pretty easy to get around, to be honest with you, but this is what the ideal is that if the government says something like Trump said, then he must be doing it, it has to be content neutral. So this doesn't appear to be content neutral because he identifies George Floyd directly. So if he wouldn't have said anything about George Floyd, if he just would have said these thugs are if he would have just said these thugs are protesting, shoot them, that would be content neutral. It's still morally reprehensible. It's not a good thing to say, but it would be content neutral. But because he identifies George Floyd and in other posts he identified Black Lives Matter, then that's not content neutral, right? He's biased against that content. He didn't apply the same standards to the quote-unquote looting and rioting that was occurring by right-wing protesters in California, in Oregon, and in North Carolina in previous instances. So in theory, it has to be content neutral, but the courts don't always define neutral very clearly. It also has to be the least aggressive means, and so they say narrowly tailored to serve some significant governmental interest. So when you see police showing up in riot gear or with dogs or shooting people, that's not the least aggressive way that they could reduce the fear or the threat of so-called chaos. Other ways that they have done it is more, if you happen to see the climate change march or the Women's Day march several years ago, It's the way that they organize the protest trail, right? So they have fencing and they have directions that police officers give. That would be the least intrusive, or that would be the most narrowly tailored way to keep social control. Now, this is the one I think that this is violated the most by the government, is there must be lots and lots, ample means lots, of alternative channels for communicating the speaker's message. So if you say that you can't protest outside the White House, which if you think about it is kind of ridiculous, but if they say you can't protest outside the White House, then you have to provide an equally effective location. Meaning that if you're trying to get your message to the president who's in the White House, then the government has to find some other location that you can get your message to the president. Now, just taking a second for, in theory, if we're just trying to be fair, we can see why this is necessary, right? If the goal is to get people to protest effectively, meaning that they have a grievance or they have a problem with the government, and the goal is to get the government to do something about it, then you want to set up a structure, an environment, where everyone's going to listen to each other. So it's like having two children that are fighting with each other, right? You want to set up some kind of a structure, a room or a place where they're going to be able to resolve their differences. So in theory, it makes sense. The problem is that the picture you see here, this is more common than not. They don't create an environment where both sides are listening to each other. They increase the aggression, they increase the hostility, which then leads to the looting, leads to the fires, leads to the riots. So it's actually the police that are causing looting and fires in most situations, not the other way around. And so this is the big dilemma of social control, of restricted rights, because remember, they're trying to get your compliance. They're trying to get you to agree that the legal system is fair. So on the other side of that, which was really the big point of the Occupy Wall Street movement, was that they started occupying, like this. So this is the opposite of the fear of looting and the chaos, right? So this is very organized protesting. But what they were doing is they were occupying public spaces that are paid for by tax dollars, by our money, that we're supposed to have access to, but that the government had limited our access to these spaces and had given private corporations the ability to use these spaces. And there's lots of examples of these spaces, from the national forests, the drilling in the ocean, to public parks, right? All sorts of places where the government was telling us we couldn't go as public people, but private corporations could go and use. And so this seemed to be a huge violation of the Constitution to people who believed in fundamental self-evident rights. So what they were arguing was, well, look, property rights in the United States, let's just say this is the way it should be, that the Constitution protects property rights. So there's two rights that have been protected that infringe on the individual rights of other people. So the first one was the doctrine of discovery, where the court ruled in Johnson versus McIntosh that Europeans were legally allowed to take land away from American Indians. And this has progressed to more and more people. And what this evolved into is this concept of adverse possession, where if I take your property and then I improve it, then I have the right to own that property. And so this is a very expansive concept of rights, right? This is not a limitation. This is not cutting. But again, it's tied to property rights. So Occupy Wall Street was really playing with this. They were showing this contradiction by saying, well, shouldn't we then have that right as the public? If the private corporations have that right, well, shouldn't the public have the same right? Shouldn't we be able to go and occupy space under the doctrine of discovery and adverse possession? Shouldn't we be able to have exclusive right to that space? So here you see those two rights, one is being reductive and one is being expansive, in full contrast with each other. And of course, the police and the New York City government said, no, you can't occupy those spaces because of time, place, and manner. And so you see which right wins out in that conflict. It's the more powerful people. But what this whole struggle has shown with these groups, from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matters to the Capitol insurrectionists, is that you gain consciousness, you gain awareness about the political system and the legal system through these activities, right? Through trying to express yourself, through organizing with other people. And so this goes from individual concepts, which we've really been talking about a lot today, largely just because you aren't organizing as students, right? If you were organizing as students for your rights, then suddenly you'd be doing interactive thinking about consciousness or awareness. And then there's this third concept of co-constitutive approaches. So, if you look at this picture to the right, these people have multiple identities, right? We're largely looking at women of color, maybe we've got particular ethnicities or nationalities, but they became, right, they were constituted, they were created housing advocates, right? So they became this new group. They had this new identity that was formed by expressing their rights consciousness, their awareness about what rights they have. And so this is the process of going from individuals to social groups to movements. And what scholars have found, and what I have found as well in my research, is that this tends to be organized. People tend to start to take on these new identities based on what we call rights talk. So they start by saying, I have a right, but then they start seeing that their rights are restricted, and so they start changing the way they see the structure. So the questions then is that, in theory, this is what you're going through as well, right? So you're learning more about the structure, you're learning about your expansive rights, you're learning about your reduction of rights. So then a bunch of questions come out to those of us who study this process, you should be asking yourself, so am I socially marginalized? Is there something within the structure that has, and so structure here is a pattern of relationships, right? So your relationship to your family, to police, to educators, to your employer, right? All these different relationships. If they're unequal, then yes, you've been socially marginalized, meaning you have been pushed to the margins. You are not in the center of the democratic structure. Your relationship is secondary. So then what does that say about your concepts of rights, fairness, justice, and equity? Does that change your ideas about these things? Are you holding on to them stronger? Do you want to look for other sources of rights? What's the difference between human rights, positive rights, natural rights, constitutional rights? I mean, all these different types of rights talk. Once you've kind of sorted that out, you want to then think about, are there others who agree with me? And the answer is, of course there are, right? But do you know who they are? Have you sought these people out? Have you engaged with them? Have you had conversations about your rights? And then what we kind of got a peek from last week, what I really wanted you to see was that there are already organizations that are advocating for you, for your rights. So what kind of difference would there be if people were aware of this and they were also working together? But then, we've talked about this a bit in this class, is so what are the barriers and obstacles to people working together? What's keeping you from working with other people to achieve equality, to achieve fairness, to get your share of the quote-unquote American dream? And then that leads us to this final question, is that, well, we should probably think about systems then, because some systems produce competition, some systems produce inequality, but some systems produce collective action. They promote groups of people working together. And so we want to think about, how does that factor into this whole concept of taking your rights, what you're aware of, and then implementing them in real life. So I'm going to stop there as you think about these questions. Ideally, what I'd be hearing from you are some answers.